Hello GCSEers. I'd just like you to think about something really simple to start off with, and that is water. You might think that's very strange to think about water, but the only reason we find it strange to actually think about how lucky we are to have it is the fact we've got plenty of it. Right, we live in England, and it rains a lot in England. We have a temperate climate, so it's quite easy to store water and keep it. Yet in some countries in the world, actually having water is an amazing thing. People have to walk miles to get it, and even then it's not clean, it's dirty. Chances that it'll give their family and their friends diseases, diarrhea and other things more worse than that. And so it leads to the question, why? Why are people poor? It's 2013, for crying out loud. We should be able to feed people in the world, There's plenty of food. And so we can think of the reasons why people are poor, and one is the location. Here you see a picture of two countries very close to each other. One is called Saudi Arabia, and it's called Sudan. And the thing is about them is that one has oil, and is actually 25% of the world's oil, and the other one doesn't. Their climates are pretty similar, so the location is just pure chance. All right, that the one has oil and is able to sell it to other people. Natural disasters. Okay, you can see. I'll put a picture in here of the floods in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. Recently, and how much suffering they cause. Natural disasters cause poverty because people just can't cope with them, and they happen frequently. Politics and corruption. Here's a picture of a country, Darfur, and a few things that are actually happening in Darfur. And the key thing to remember is that a conflict in Darfur has been going on for 25 years, and at least around 200,000 people have died, and 2 million others have left their homes. And so the corruption in that country has left the poverty for the people of that region. It's just disgraceful. Climate. Again, we might moan about snow or the rain, but I hate to live in some of the places in the world where it's just too hot, and we can't grow anything. You can't feed your animals to be able to live off them either. Population growth. Population growth is huge in the world. The key thing is that infants die, babies die, so people value children, and so often they have too many of them, and maybe that's because they can't get hold of contraception. But the key thing is that the children. But the biggest cause of world poverty is probably world trade and debt. And the fact is that we're going to look at people giving aid, people giving money soon. But the key thing is to remember is that for every pound that we give to people like Comic Relief and to people like to CAFOD and Opportunity International that we're going to look at soon, Islamic Relief, for every pound we give, £5 is given back by that country in debt. And these debts have happened in the past, and there's been a massive call recently for governments to actually cut off the debt, because most of it's now just being paid off. Most of the debt's been paid off. It's just interest that people are paying. And so the key thing is that to remember is those are the reasons why. Now, go back to this aid thing, because we're going to look at how religious people help other people. Most of it's through aid, giving charity money and things like that. I suppose the big question is this. You might have heard of this before. It was on adverts, and that is, if you give a man a fish, he can feed his family for a day. If you give a man the means to fish, he can feed his family forever. Now, we might be thinking to ourselves that, what does that mean? Now, the key thing is that if you give a man any amount of food, then he can feed himself for a short amount of time. If you give him the means to make the food, or to catch it, in the fish's case, then he can feed his family for an awful lot longer. And the key thing to remember with that is that what's better, feeding them soon or feeding them for a long period of time? Now, you might say, obviously, sir, it's a long period of time. It must be the case because, you'd rather that they stood on their own 2 feet. Now, I agree with you completely. But sometimes you need to give them the aid quickly, because they might be a victim of a natural disaster or a war in their country. So they need the fish. They need the fish to feed them straight away. Whereas other times, once they've settled down a bit, 6 months later, a year later, then they need the means to be able to find that for themselves. Now, why? Why would we give either short-term or long-term aid? Why do people do it? Well, there's 3 major reasons. And the first one of those is a sense of justice. Okay, a sense of justice. It's not right in the world that people do not have enough. Okay, it's not right. It's a sense of right and wrong. Okay, as you can see by these scales here. Everybody has more than enough. The world has enough food to feed everybody else. So it's not fair that some people have and some people do not. So often people give money to charities because they think to themselves, well, I have enough to feed myself and my family, so therefore other people should have the same. Another one is a word called stewardship. Now we often think of stewards being on a plane, people who look after us when we're on a plane, but traditionally the idea is taken from the creation story in the Bible for Christians and Jewish people, where God seems to ask us to look after the world. Now, whether you're religious or not doesn't matter, really, but we all live on this rock that's hurtling around the sun 67,000 miles an hour. So we all have a responsibility to help others. And a quote I'd like you to think about is one that was made by Chief Seattle, who an Indian chief in America, and he said, "We have not been given the world by our parents, but we've been loaned it by our children." Now that obviously means that our children loan the world to us, and that means that we have to look after it so that their children can have a world to live in, and their children. Finally, the third one is the idea of compassion. All right, empathy. We all often watch movies and things like that bring us to tears, and that's how charities work. You've seen it all on the telly, comic relief, they give you a few jokes and then all of a sudden, wham, they show you some scene of a starving child in the third world, and it makes you go, oh my God, I want to give some money. And that purely and simply is the idea of, I must show compassion to these people. So I must be able to show what it is. So people give money and expect these charities to give either long-term or short-term aid. But the key thing is that we can actually do something now. We can do something now about it. All of us, you lot, sat there now, can actually do something about it. One simple way that I'm going to tell you about is fair trade. Now, fair trade is a system whereby people fight against what's called unfair trade. Unfair trade, often grown in food crops grown in other countries. Us over in this country, we pay relatively cheaply for it. So the people who actually produce it and actually make the products like bananas or chocolate are the big ones, all right, coffee, are often getting hardly any money for the amount of work that they do. And the supermarkets and the big companies over in the UK and in other places make loads of money. Now, fair trade was a solution. Well, is fair trade a solution? But fair trade was sort of brought about in the early 90s by various different charities. Basically, what they say is that they look at how people are paid. And they say, well, if we're going to give the big money to the supermarkets, then we've got to give some money to the people who actually produce it. And fair trade organisations basically say whether or not they actually do that. And I'm going to put a link on there to Cadbury's. The Cadbury's do a lot of work for fair trade, and you should also always buy Cadbury's chocolate, because what they do is they actually give a lot of money to people who actually produce the cocoa beans for them. So the key thing to remember is when we look at it, all right, the idea of fair trade. I'll put a few links on there for you. Is that actually it does work, and people do get a better price. The idea of fair trade. So it actually works, and people the people in third world countries do make a lot more money. And so what I'd like you to do, please, is I'd like you to think about should we in the West pay a little bit more for items like bananas and chocolate and cocoa, in order so that people in the third world get a fairer price? Key question is, what do you think?